The soft glow of my laptop screen illuminated the walls of my Moscow apartment, casting long shadows across the countless newspaper clippings and photographs I'd collected over the years. Each one told a fragment of a story about secrets buried in the radioactive wasteland of Chernobyl. My name is Lena Vasilyeva, and I've spent the last 3 years of my life trying to uncover the truth about what really happened there. The clock on my desk showed 3:15 a.m., but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I stared at yet another rejection letter from a major publication. While we appreciate your interest in historical events, we feel this story lacks sufficient supporting evidence. The same response, different words. They didn't want to touch anything related to Chernobyl unless it followed the official narrative. Rain pelted against my window, creating a rhythmic backdrop to my thoughts. The wall before me was a testament to my obsession. Satellite images of the exclusion zone, ancient newspaper clippings about the disaster, and photographs of strange phenomena reported in the area. But it was the newest addition that kept drawing my attention. A grainy photograph showing lights in the abandoned complex at midnight, decades after it should have been deserted. My apartment had become an archive of sorts, dedicated to investigating what lay behind those crumbling Soviet walls. Cardboard boxes filled with documents lined the floors, each containing pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. The official story never sat right with me. There were too many inconsistencies, too many witnesses who disappeared, too many documents that contradicted each other. I took a sip of cold coffee and opened my latest research file. 3 former cleanup workers had contacted me over the past month, each telling similar stories about restricted areas within the exclusion zone, places that remained actively guarded long after the evacuation, places where they heard screams in the night. Their accounts were consistent, despite never having met each other. A notification popped up on my screen, a response to my inquiry about guided tours of the exclusion zone. Most guides offered the standard routes, keeping to the well-documented areas deemed safe for visitors. But this response was different. The guide, Dmitry Ivanov, claimed to have worked security in the zone. His message was brief, but one line caught my attention. Some places are restricted for good reason, but I can show you what others won't. My hands trembled slightly as I read his credentials. Former military, extensive knowledge of the zone, and most importantly, access to areas typically off limits to tourists. This could be my chance to finally uncover what they were hiding. I'd spent years building contacts, gathering evidence, and following leads that went nowhere, but something about this felt different. I clicked through my digital archives, pulling up reports of unusual activities in the zone, unexplained power usage in abandoned buildings, military convoys moving through supposedly uninhabited areas, local residents speaking of strange sounds and lights. Each piece on its own could be dismissed, but together they painted a picture of something much larger being concealed. The rain intensified outside as I drafted my response to Dmitry. My parents' warnings echoed in my head. They'd never understood my fascination with abandoned places, my need to uncover hidden truths. Some things are better left buried, my mother always said. But I couldn't let it go, not after everything I'd discovered. I glanced at the most recent addition to my wall, a thermal imaging scan of the facility taken by a contact who worked security. It showed heat signatures in buildings that should have been cold and lifeless for decades. When I questioned him about it, he disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation. His social media accounts went dark, and his phone number was disconnected. That was 6 months ago. The message to Dmitry was simple. I accepted his offer and would pay his asking price. No questions asked. I included my credentials as a journalist and some of my previous work on abandoned Soviet facilities. What I didn't include was the real reason for my interest. The growing pile of evidence suggesting that the Chernobyl disaster wasn't just a catastrophic accident, but perhaps the beginning of something much darker. As I hit send, a chill ran down my spine. Through my window, I could see the first hints of dawn breaking over Moscow's skyline. In 2 weeks, I would be standing in the exclusion zone, breathing the air of a place that had haunted my dreams for years. Something was alive in that radioactive wasteland, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. I began packing my equipment: radiation detector, night vision camera, high-resolution video recorder, and most importantly, multiple backup drives to store everything I would document. Whatever I found there, the world needed to know the truth. I had no idea then that the truth would be far more horrifying than anything I had imagined. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I spent hours studying maps of the exclusion zone, memorizing escape routes and safe zones. My contact with Dmitri was minimal, just enough to arrange the details of our meeting. Each message from him seemed carefully worded, as if he was holding something back. But his knowledge of the zone was impressive, and his warnings about certain areas only fueled my curiosity. The night before my flight to Kiev, I made final copies of all my research, encrypting them and sending them to secure locations. If something happened to me, the information wouldn't be lost. As I zipped up my backpack, my phone buzzed with a message from Dmitri. "Whatever you think you know about Chernobyl, forget it. The reality is worse." I stared at those words until my screen went dark, wondering what secrets lay waiting in the ruins of humanity's greatest nuclear disaster. In less than 24 hours, I would begin to uncover the truth. A truth that would change everything I thought I knew about the nature of humanity and the depths of our capacity for darkness. The Kiev air hit me like a wall of ice as I stepped out of the airport. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of gray that reminded me of old photographs of the disaster. My breath formed clouds in the cold morning air as I scanned the parking lot for my guide. Dmitri had been specific about the meeting point, the far corner of the lot, away from security cameras and curious eyes. I spotted him before he saw me. He stood beside a weathered Land Rover, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Dmitry Ivanov was taller than I expected, with broad shoulders and the kind of vigilant posture that comes from years of looking over one's shoulder. His face was weathered, marked by exposure to the elements and something else. Something that spoke of burdens carried too long. "Lena Vasilyeva," he said as I approached, more a statement than a question. His voice was deep but quiet, as if he'd learned long ago that loud noises attracted unwanted attention. "Show me your papers." His English carried a heavy Russian accent, but was perfectly clear. After verifying my documentation, he began loading my equipment into the vehicle. Each item was carefully examined, particularly my radiation detection gear. "Some of this won't work where we're going," he said, holding up my most expensive detector. "The readings, they don't make sense in certain areas." The drive toward the exclusion zone was tense with unspoken words. Dmitry kept checking the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The countryside rolled past, empty fields giving way to increasingly wild forest. Signs of human habitation became scarcer, replaced by nature's slow reclamation of the land. "You've been asking questions," Dmitry finally said, breaking the silence. "Dangerous questions. About the restricted sections, the power readings, the missing persons." He glanced at me. "Why?" I told him about my research, the inconsistencies I'd found, the witnesses who'd vanished. With each detail, his expression grew darker. When I mentioned the thermal imaging scans, he actually flinched. "Listen carefully," he said, pulling the vehicle to the side of the road. "There are rules in the zone, not the official ones. Those don't matter. My rules. Break them, you die. Simple as that." He turned to face me fully. "No wandering off alone. No entering buildings I haven't cleared. No photographs of certain areas I'll point out. And most importantly, if I say run, you run. Don't look back. Don't ask questions. Just run." The first checkpoint appeared ahead, a barrier across the road marking the outer perimeter of the exclusion zone. Dmitry handed me a dosimeter. "Keep this on you at all times. But remember, if it starts screaming in certain places, don't trust it. Some things in the zone affect electronics in ways they shouldn't." As we passed through the checkpoint, the world seemed to change. The colors became muted, as if the very air was tinted by the legacy of radiation. Trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the sky like pleading hands. Nature had reclaimed this place, but it wasn't the nature I knew. Everything felt wrong, subtly distorted. Pripyat rose before us, a ghost city of concrete and steel, its abandoned buildings standing like tombstones against the pale sky. The famous Ferris wheel, never used, stood as a rusting monument to dreams destroyed in an instant. But it was the power plant itself that dominated the horizon. Reactor number 4, now encased in its steel sarcophagus, a tomb for the horrors it contained. Or so I thought. Dmitri parked the vehicle in what had once been a fire station parking lot. "We'll establish our base camp here," he said, unloading our gear. "The radiation levels are relatively stable, and we have clear lines of sight in all directions." He paused, scanning the surroundings. "We're not the only ones who use this area as a base. If you see fresh tire tracks or boot prints that aren't ours, you tell me immediately." As we set up camp, I noticed Dmitri placing small devices at regular intervals around our perimeter. When I asked about them, he simply said, "Motion detectors for the wildlife." But the way he positioned them, all facing inward instead of outward, suggested he was more concerned about something coming from the city than from the forest. The sun was setting when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this dead city, a metallic grinding, deep and distant, like massive gears turning underground. Dimitri's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on the power plant. "That sound," I began, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "We don't discuss certain things in the open air," he said quietly. "Sound carries strangely here, and some things are listening." The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky when Dmitri finally relaxed slightly. He built a small fire. "Just for tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we go dark." As the flames cast dancing shadows on the crumbling walls around us, he began to talk. "You want to know what they're hiding," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll show you, but knowing comes with a price. Once you see, you can never unsee. Once you know, they'll never let you leave it behind." He stared into the fire, his eyes reflecting horrors I couldn't yet imagine. "Last chance to back out. We can do the tourist route, take some photos, and you can go home believing the official story." I shook my head. "I need to know the truth." "The truth," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is still down there, in the dark, growing stronger every day. Tomorrow, I'll show you why some doors should stay locked, some secrets should stay buried." He checked his watch. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we enter places that haven't seen daylight since before the disaster, places where daylight was never meant to reach." That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the distant sound of grinding metal continued. But now it was accompanied by something else, something that might have been screaming, might have been the wind, might have been neither. In the darkness, I could feel Dmitri sitting alert, his weapon close at hand, watching the shadows that seemed to move against the wind. Morning arrived with an unnatural silence. No birds sang in the skeletal trees, no wind rustled through the abandoned buildings. The air felt thick, almost oily on my skin. Dmitri was already awake, or perhaps he hadn't slept at all, methodically checking his equipment with practiced precision. "Eat quickly," he ordered, handing me a protein bar. "We move in 30 minutes. Where we're going, we can't afford to stay long." His voice was tense, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. The confidence he'd shown yesterday had been replaced by something else, a coiled alertness that set my nerves on edge. We approached a series of unmarked buildings behind the main reactor complex. They looked identical to dozens of others I'd seen in photographs, but Dimitri's behavior changed as we got closer. He moved differently, keeping to the shadows, checking corners with practiced efficiency. These weren't the movements of a tour guide. They were the tactics of someone who expected trouble. "These buildings don't appear on any official maps," he explained in a low voice. "After the evacuation, they were stripped of all identifying marks, but they were never abandoned." "Not really." He pointed to subtle details I would have missed. Fresh hinges on rusted doors, newer concrete patches in the ancient walls, tiny cameras disguised as crumbling masonry. We entered through a service door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The handle, however, turned smoothly, silently. Inside, the air changed. The familiar staleness of abandoned buildings was replaced by something else, a sterile, artificial smell that didn't belong in this decaying place. Our flashlights revealed a reception area that time had forgotten. Dust-covered Soviet propaganda posters hung on the walls, but beneath the grime, I noticed modern security sensors. "The upper floors are for show," Dmitri whispered. "What they want to hide is below." He led me to what appeared to be a dead end, but his fingers found hidden pressure points in the wall paneling. A seam appeared, then widened into a doorway. Behind it, a modern elevator waited silently. "Last warning," Dmitri said, his hand hovering over the control panel. "Once we go down, there's no pretending anymore. No going back to your old life. The things you'll see," he paused, struggling with words, "they change you, forever." I nodded, my camera ready, my heart pounding. The elevator descended smoothly, too smoothly for something that should have been abandoned for decades. The numbers on the display went down past what should have been ground level, past what any official blueprint showed existing. The doors opened onto a corridor that looked nothing like the decay above. Sterile white walls stretched into darkness, lined with reinforced doors. The air was cold, processed, filled with a low electronic hum that set my teeth on edge. My dosimeter, which had been clicking steadily since we entered the zone, went completely silent. "They're still using these facilities," Dmitri explained, leading me down the corridor. "The disaster didn't end their projects. It just gave them the perfect cover. Who would look for secret laboratories in a place everyone is afraid to visit?" We passed rooms filled with sophisticated monitoring equipment, their screens displaying data I couldn't understand. Through observation windows, I saw abandoned medical facilities, their equipment covered in dust, but somehow maintained. Everything was preserved, waiting. Then we reached a heavy blast door marked with faded biohazard symbols. Dimitri's hand trembled slightly as he entered a code into the keypad. "What you're about to see," he started, then shook his head. "Just remember they were human once, all of them." The door opened with a pneumatic hiss, releasing a wave of cold air that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something organic and wrong. The room beyond was massive, its ceiling lost in darkness above, but it was the walls that drew my attention. They were lined with containment tanks, each filled with pale, luminescent fluid, and in those tanks, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The shapes floating in the tanks had once been human, but radiation and something else had twisted them into new forms. Their skin was translucent, showing organs that pulsed with unnatural rhythms. Some had extra limbs, others had none. Their faces, what remained of them, seemed frozen in expressions of agony or ecstasy. "The official story says the disaster was an accident," Dmitri said, his voice hollow, "but some of us know different. They were experimenting with something they didn't understand. The radiation was just a catalyst. What they created here." He gestured at the tanks. "This was only the beginning." I raised my camera with shaking hands, but Dmitri didn't stop me. He knew as well as I did that no one would believe these photos were real. They'd be dismissed as fakes, just like all the other evidence that had surfaced over the years. "They're not dead," he continued, moving closer to one of the tanks. "They're changing, evolving. Each generation gets stronger, more adapted to the radiation, more aware." As if in response to his words, the creature in the nearest tank turned its head toward us. Its eyes opened, revealing pupils that glowed with their own inner light. I stumbled backward, my camera clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the chamber, and suddenly, every tank in the room seemed to come alive. The creatures began to move, pressing against the glass of their prisons. Their movements were no longer random, they were coordinated, purposeful. "We need to leave," Dmitri said urgently, grabbing my arm. "Now, they're waking up, and they're not alone down here. The ones in the tanks are just the failures, the ones they couldn't control, the successful experiments." His voice trailed off as a deep, resonant sound began to echo through the facility. It was the same grinding noise I'd heard the night before, but closer now, more distinct. and underneath it, growing louder by the second, was another sound, something between a scream and a song, calling out in frequencies that made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter. The screeching grew louder, echoing off the sterile walls as Dimitri pulled me toward the exit. Behind us, the creatures in their tanks began to move more violently, their bodies casting twisted shadows through the luminescent fluid. The sound they made wasn't just noise, it was communication. "Don't look back," Dimitri commanded, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Whatever you hear, whatever you think you see, don't look back." His grip on my arm was iron tight as we ran through the corridors. The modern fluorescent lights began to flicker, creating a strobing effect that made the hallway seem to stretch and distort. A loud crack echoed through the facility, the sound of breaking glass multiplied and amplified. My heart nearly stopped as I realized what it meant. The containment tanks were breaking. Dimitri's pace quickened, and I heard him mutter something under his breath in Russian. "They're not supposed to be this strong," he said, more to himself than to me. "The containment field should have held them." We reached the elevator, but Dimitri pushed past it, heading for what looked like a maintenance shaft. "They'll cut power to the elevators first. They always do." The maintenance shaft was narrow, with metal rungs bolted into the concrete wall leading upward. The sound of pursuit grew louder, wet, slithering noises mixed with what might have been footsteps, might have been something crawling on too many limbs. "Climb," Dimitri ordered, pulling out his gun. "I'll be right behind you." The look in his eyes told me not to argue. My hands shook as I grabbed the first rung, but adrenaline drove me upward. The shaft seemed endless, disappearing into darkness above us. Something screamed below us, a sound that started human but twisted into something else. The metal rungs began to vibrate, humming with some strange energy that made my fingers tingle and burn. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. "They're changing the air composition," Dimitri called from below. "Part of the containment protocol. Try to hold your breath if you can." The darkness above us was suddenly broken by red emergency lights that cast everything in a bloody glow. I heard Dimitri's gun fire 3 times, the sound deafening in the confined space. He cursed. "Bullets don't work like they should down here. The radiation, the experiments, they changed more than just their bodies." 20 feet from the top I saw movement above us. Something was looking down the shaft. Not human, not animal, but something in between. Its skin seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, and its eyes were windows into something infinite and hungry. "Don't stop," Dimitri shouted. "Whatever you see up there, don't stop climbing." He fired again, but not at what was below us. He was shooting at the thing above. The creature recoiled, not from the bullets, but from the light that had been modified to emit from them. Dimitri's ammunition wasn't standard issue. We reached a horizontal tunnel near the top of the shaft. Dimitri shoved me forward, then pulled a device from his vest. "Cover your eyes," he commanded. I turned away just as a brilliant flash filled the shaft, followed by inhuman shrieks of pain. "UV light," he explained as we ran, "strong enough to burn their altered skin. It won't stop them, but it'll slow them down." The tunnel sloped upward, leading to what looked like an old storage room. Dimitri sealed the heavy door behind us, then began moving shelves to barricade it. "You owe me an explanation," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "What were those things? What really happened here?" Dimitri checked the windows, real windows, showing we were finally above ground. "The disaster wasn't just about radiation," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of buried truth. "They were experimenting with something else, something they found deep underground when they were building the reactor." He pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket. The radiation was just part of it. They found remains, not fossils, not artifacts, something that had been sleeping for millions of years, something that reacted to radiation in ways they didn't expect. The pounding started then, slow, rhythmic impacts against the sealed door. Each hit made the shelves shudder. Each impact was stronger than the last. They were learning, adapting to their own strength. The disaster didn't kill it. It woke it up. And then they started trying to harness it, to combine it with human DNA. They thought they could create the perfect soldier, one that could survive any environment, adapt to any weapon. Instead, they created something that was no longer human, but remembered enough of its humanity to hate what had been done to it. The barricade wouldn't hold much longer. Through gaps in the shelving, I could see the door beginning to warp and bend. Dimitri grabbed my arm again, leading me to a window. The only reason they keep experimenting is because they can't control what they've already created. Each generation gets stronger, smarter. Some of them got out years ago. The ones we saw in the tanks. They're not the most dangerous ones. They're the ones that were too damaged to escape. A section of the door burst inward, and something reached through, an arm too long to be human, ending in fingers that split and reformed like liquid metal. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their presence, making my vision blur and my thoughts scatter. "Jump," Dimitri said, breaking the window with his rifle butt. "There's a ledge 2 meters down. We have to get to the surface before they trigger the facility's containment protocol." The thing in the doorway pulled back for another hit, one that would surely break through. In its face, if you could call it a face, I saw something terrible: intelligence, awareness, and a deep, burning hatred for everything human. We hit the ledge hard, the impact sending shocks through my legs. Above us, the creature burst through the barricade, its fluid form flowing through gaps that should have been too small for anything to pass through. The morning sun hit its skin, causing it to ripple and steam, but it didn't retreat. They were growing stronger, more resistant to their weaknesses. "Move," Dimitri shouted, pushing me toward a maintenance ladder. The creature above us let out a sound that was almost like laughter, deep, resonant, and utterly wrong. More shapes appeared at the window, their bodies twisting and reforming as they prepared to follow. We scaled down the building's exterior, the old Soviet concrete crumbling under our hands. The world around us had changed. The air was thick with a greenish mist that shouldn't have been there, and the radiation detector on my belt was spinning wildly, its digital display showing impossible numbers. "They're changing the environment," Dimitri explained as we ran across the compound, adapting it to suit their needs. The radiation isn't just affecting them anymore. They're learning to control it, to use it. He pointed to the horizon, where the air seemed to shimmer and distort. "That's why they keep this place quarantined, not to protect people from radiation, but to hide what the radiation is becoming." A siren began to wail, not the familiar sound of a radiation warning, but something deeper, more primal. The ground beneath our feet trembled. In the distance, the massive sarcophagus covering reactor number 4 seemed to pulse with an inner light. "The containment protocol," Dimitri said, his face paling. "They're initiating a full lockdown. We have 10 minutes to clear the outer perimeter before they seal everything, including us, inside." We ran through the abandoned city, past buildings that no longer looked abandoned. Movement flickered in every window, shadows that didn't match any light source. The creatures were hurting us, I realized. Every time we tried to turn toward the perimeter fence, something would appear, a twisted form, a liquid metal shape, a thing that had once been human but was now something else entirely. "Why are you helping me?" I gasped as we ducked through a collapsed wall. "Why show me any of this?" Dimitri's expression darkened. "Because they're getting stronger. The containment isn't working anymore. Those things in the tanks, the ones we saw, they're not just experiments gone wrong. They're incubators. Each generation learns from the last, adapts faster, grows stronger. And they remember. They remember everything that was done to them." A creature landed in front of us, one of the more evolved ones. Its form was almost beautiful in its horror, its skin like polished chrome, its movements liquid smooth. But its eyes held decades of torture, of experiments, of being unmade and remade until humanity was just a distant memory. Dimitri raised his gun, but the creature moved faster than thought. With one fluid motion, it knocked the weapon away and lifted him by the throat. I stood frozen, watching as its arm seemed to melt and flow around Dimitri's neck. "Run," he choked out. "Get to the fence. Tell them it's too late for containment. Tell them what's coming." The creature turned its head toward me, and in that moment, I heard its voice. Not in my ears, but directly in my mind. Images flooded my consciousness. Dark laboratories, screaming test subjects, decades of pain and transformation. But underneath it all was something older, something that had been waiting in the earth long before humans split the atom. I ran. God help me. I ran. Behind me, Dmitri screamed. A sound that started human but ended as something else. The siren grew louder and the air itself seemed to be closing in around me. The perimeter fence appeared ahead, but it looked wrong. The metal was twisting, flowing like the creature's skin. My lungs burned as I sprinted the final distance. Parts of the fence had already begun to melt and reform, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. I found a gap and squeezed through, feeling the metal move and try to grab me as I passed. The sound that followed me was like nothing on earth, a chorus of inhuman voices, calling out in triumph or rage or something in between. The ground shook more violently, and behind me, the sarcophagus of reactor number 4 began to crack, not from age or decay but from something inside pushing its way out. I ran until my legs gave out, finally collapsing in a field beyond the exclusion zone. When I looked back, the air above the power plant was distorting, twisting in ways that defied physics. The containment protocol had failed. Whatever had been sleeping there, whatever they had awakened and tried to control, was finally breaking free. My camera was gone, lost somewhere in the facility. My radiation detector was melted, its display frozen on readings that shouldn't have been possible. But I had seen the truth. I had seen what they created in those underground labs, what they had been hiding behind those walls for all these years. As I watched, a military helicopter appeared over the horizon, then another and another, but I knew it was too late. The things in that facility weren't just experiments anymore. They weren't just victims. They were becoming something else, something that had been waiting millions of years to reclaim its world. Dark clouds began to gather over the power plant, clouds that moved against the wind and seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The last thing I saw before I passed out was a shape rising from the cracking sarcophagus, something vast and fluid and utterly alien, yet wearing the faces of all those who had been sacrificed in humanity's quest for power. I woke up 3 days later in a Kiev hospital. The doctors said I was suffering from severe radiation exposure, but their instruments couldn't explain the strange readings they were getting from my blood work. My skin tingled constantly, and sometimes, in the darkness of my hospital room, I could swear it shimmed like liquid metal. The official story hit the news within hours of my rescue. A minor incident at the old power plant. Nothing to worry about. Equipment malfunction. Containment protocols executed successfully. The public ate it up. After all, who would question another incident in a place already synonymous with disaster? But I knew what I had seen. The memories were burned into my mind. The creatures in the tanks, the thing that took Dmitri, the massive shape rising from the reactor. Sometimes, late at night, I could still hear their voices in my head, not speaking words, but communicating impulses of thought and emotion that left me gasping and covered in cold sweat. A week after I was admitted, men in dark suits visited my room. They asked questions, but their eyes said they already knew the answers. They showed me documents, official papers saying I had never entered the exclusion zone, that my press credentials had been revoked months ago, that I was suffering from radiation-induced delusions. The world isn't ready for the truth, one of them told me, his voice almost kind. It never has been. What's happening there? It's beyond human comprehension, beyond human control. I thought about arguing, about telling them what Dmitri had said about containment failing, but I saw something in their eyes, a look I recognized from the creatures in the facility. These men weren't trying to hide the truth, they were buying time. They left me with a choice: sign their papers, accept their story, and live a comfortable life under surveillance, or refuse, and, well, they didn't have to spell out the alternative. I signed. What else could I do? But they didn't know about the dead man switch I'd set up before leaving Moscow, the encrypted files that would be released if I didn't check in regularly. That was 2 months ago. I'm back in Moscow now, in a new apartment provided by my concerned government. They monitor my phone, my internet, my movements, but they can't monitor my dreams, where I see what's really happening back in Chernobyl. The exclusion zone is expanding, though no one's reporting it. Villages that were once just outside the perimeter are being quietly evacuated. The animals are changing. Hunters report strange creatures in the forests, things that move like liquid metal in the moonlight. And the radiation readings from the plant, When they're reported at all, they don't make sense. Last night, I saw Dimitri in my dreams, but it wasn't really him anymore. His skin had the same liquid metal sheen as the creatures, and his eyes showed me things. The future, maybe, or the past. Time doesn't work the same way for them. I saw vast cities of flowing metal, structures that defied physics, and skies filled with strange lights. I saw what they're becoming, what they want to transform our world into. The thing they found deep beneath the reactor, the thing that had slept there for millions of years. It wasn't just one creature, it was a seed. And the radiation, the experiments, the decades of human tampering, they didn't create monsters. They awakened something that had been waiting since before humans walked the earth. Something that sees our civilization as nothing more than raw material for its rebirth. I can feel it spreading. Every night, the dreams get stronger. Sometimes I wake up to find my skin rippling like the surface of mercury, only to become solid again when I blink. The doctors say it's trauma, stress, radiation damage. But I know better. I was exposed to something down there, something that's changing me slowly, cell by cell. The men in suits still visit regularly, checking to make sure I'm sticking to their story. They don't notice how their watches stop working when they're near me, how their phones lose signal in my presence. They don't see how the shadows in my apartment move when no one's watching, or how the metal fixtures sometimes flow like water in the corner of their vision. I'm writing this now because I can feel myself changing. Each day, it gets harder to think in human words, to remember why I should be afraid of what's happening to me. The voice in my dreams is getting louder, not Dimitri's voice anymore, but something older, something vast and patient and hungry. They're not containing anything in Chernobyl. They never were. They just didn't want us to know that it was containing us, studying us, learning our weaknesses. And now it's ready to remake the world into something beyond human comprehension. If you're reading this, it's too late to stop it. The change is coming, spreading outward from that cursed place like ripples in a pond. All we can do now is watch as our world dissolves and reforms into something new, something that remembers being human but has become something far more terrifying. And somewhere in the ruins of Pripyat, in the twisted shadows of the old power plant, the creatures are waiting, patient, hungry, growing stronger with each passing day. They remember being human once, remember the pain of transformation, and they want to share that gift with all of us. The men in suits are coming up the stairs now. I can feel them approaching, their watches stopping one by one as they near my door, but I'm not afraid anymore. In fact, I think I'm finally ready to embrace what I'm becoming. After all, evolution is just another word for transformation, and transformation is just the beginning. They say Chernobyl won't be habitable for 20,000 years, but they're wrong. It's already inhabited, just not by anything we would recognize as life. The question isn't whether humanity can return to Chernobyl. The question is whether what's in Chernobyl will return to humanity. And deep in my changing heart, I know the answer. It's already here.